Please be seated. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all. Today is the final day in what has been a 5-week streak of hearing about bread on Sundays. So we made it, Christ Church. Well done. Most of my colleagues out in the preaching world gave up on bread about 3 weeks ago and started preaching from Ephesians or something like that. And we are tenacious. 5 out of 5, batting 1,000. Well done. Well done. As I said a couple weeks ago, I think in this service, I know I said it upstairs, it's kind of a whirlwind for me. I've preached 5 Sundays in a row on bread, so I can't remember where I am anymore, to be honest. A few weeks ago, I mentioned this, and I think it's really true, that though we have had 5 weeks in a row with a gospel reading that starts off talking about bread, if we still think that Jesus is talking about bread, we've really kind of missed the point that he's been driving at for the last several weeks. It's not about bread anymore. It stopped being about bread a long time ago. It started off with bread, and then it became life and love and eternal life and all these other things. Now we're really in an entirely new place today. And I mean that literally as well. When Jesus was teaching earlier, if you recall, he had fed 5,000 people out on a mountainside, and then he picked up the next day and he left, and people followed him and wanted to talk to him more about bread, and so he obliged with many, many verses. And now he is with his disciples in a synagogue in Capernaum. So he has gone, and these folks who had been opponents of his about this bread aren't there anymore. Instead, you've got the folks who really ought to know something about what Jesus is talking about. They've been following him for a long time. It's not just what we would call the 12 disciples, Peter and James and John and so on and so forth. It's not just them. It's all of the people who would call themselves ones who follow and learn from Jesus. And there are plenty of them at this point. We're 6 chapters in. We're at the end of the 6th chapter. So you think about it, he's changed water to wine, and he's called disciples from their nets, and so on and so. He's been at this for a while. He's got a crowd. And they've seen, and they've heard, and they've touched, and they've known who Jesus is. Enough to know that every now and then he's going to say some weird stuff. And every now and then, if we listen a little bit more, we'll find the real meaning behind it. And yet, they too have difficulty with all this bread stuff. We see that today, right? This is a difficult teaching. Who can accept this? They ask that not about what they heard in the synagogue in Capernaum that Saturday morning. I'm going to guess it was a Saturday morning. Because they've been with him too long to be weirded out by that, right? And they've heard this stuff too long. They know it's a bigger thing than that. And here's how you can know that they know it's a bigger thing. John does this thing, and he does it all the time, where the Gospel of John will use a word, and we've talked about this before with things like life, right? We say life. John has 2 different words that he can use, and he chooses them wisely to sort of drive a point home. Sometimes John only has 1 word to use, and he uses that word, but it has 2 meanings, and he lets us play with it a little bit. It's a really great linguistic tool. So he puts this word in, and the word in Greek is the word word. I'm going to end up saying word a lot, so get used to that. It's logos. You've heard that before. Logos is really how it should be pronounced. Logos. The word. What they have translated that for us today as is teaching. Word, logos, can mean teaching, sure. In the Gospel of John, we ought to go, whoa, but word means something different in the Gospel of John, right? Y'all know that. Y'all who've been around church for a long time, y'all know that. Just think about it for a second. You'll get there if you're not there already. That's how the Gospel of John begins. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos. And the Word was with God. And the Word was God. The Word is, this is how John says it, all things came into being through it. and not one thing exists apart from it. Eventually, as it unfolds, John will say, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, filled with grace and truth. And that's the beginning of the story of Jesus for the Gospel of John, right? Over and over and over again. This is the Word made flesh, the Word made flesh. When we get over here, and we're 6 chapters in, and Jesus and his disciples are talking about the Word, the Logos, it's not about that teaching. It's about all those teachings. It's about all that stuff, all that grace and truth that came into the world. It's about the way that Jesus says, oh yeah, and by the way, God so loved the world that God sent his only Son into the world, made the Word flesh, not to condemn the world, but so that the world might find life through him. Or when Jesus says, yeah, these are challenging things I know, but I'm going to be lifted up on a cross, and when I am lifted up on the cross, I'll draw the whole world to myself. Those are difficult teachings. When Jesus stops to heal a blind man or to cure a person of leprosy, when Jesus reaches into the lives of people who feel that they must be unlovable or unloved and tells them that they are a beloved child of God, these are difficult teachings. It's a difficult word to accept. It's a difficult logos to bring into our lives and begin to live that way. I was out on Friday night, past my bedtime, with a group of parishioners. That's what's going to make it okay. And I won't name names, though, because we were out past our bedtime, and this place only served beer. So there you go. You know all the detail you need to know now. One of the parishioners was asking me a question. He said, what is your absolute favorite thing that you do at work? Like, what really makes you feel alive? And I answered his question, and that's a sermon for another day. I'll skip that part. After I gave him a satisfactory answer, he's a lawyer, so he was going after me. He said, all right, what's the thing you just hate? Like, what's the thing that keeps you up at night? What do you dread the next day? And I gave that some serious consideration. And I don't have a long list of things I don't love about being a priest. I gave it some consideration and eventually came to the conclusion that what is most challenging to me is when I or others refuse to believe that grace is real. Now, I say those words carefully because here's what I know about myself. I believe grace is real. I sometimes refuse to act like it, but I believe it's real. I think almost all of us believe it's real, even when we fail to act like that. But there are some folks who just refuse to believe that grace is real. I know you've probably encountered some in your life. Some of them come to church a lot. These folks who would object to grace because it's not fair. And you want to say, like, yeah, that's the point. It's not fair. If it were fair, none of us would get it because none of us are perfect. And they say, but there are rules in this universe, and grace says that those rules don't count for anything. You know, grace says that it won't be counted against you. And that is the point. Grace is willing to break the rule to come tell you how loved you are, in spite of the fact that you didn't follow the rules. There are some folks who, after hearing all of that, will still say, you can have grace. I'm going to stick with my life and my reality. That keeps me up at night. The encounters with folks like that, that's what keeps me up at night. It's challenging. The reality is that church often can be a place that's filled with that kind of operating, right? And operating as if grace isn't real. There are some churches, it's too difficult for them. They become like the disciples who say, we're walking away. We'd rather do judgment. There aren't a lot of churches that say, we're going to do grace so well. So few, in fact, that if you went out and you asked people in the world what the top 5 words are that they would use to characterize the churches that they know, I bet most of them would get to 5 words without using the word grace. Many of them would get there without using the word love. It can happen sometimes. They're difficult concepts. They're challenging enough that those words don't even appear in our creed. You say, this is what we believe, and the word love's not in there. The concept of love, I would say, is in there, but not the word. It's a challenging concept to understand. I get that. But when we see it, we know it, and then we hold it, right? I told this story today only to find out that a lot of you already know who this person is, which is a great thing. He's been around for a long time. I'll skip some of the biographical information about him now that I know that some of you know. But there's a great evangelical teacher and preacher. He's in his mid-80s now. I imagine he is officially retired, though he still seems to engage a lot of folks in a lot of different ways. His name's Tony Campolo. You heard that name before? Really wonderful storyteller. On YouTube, you can see him telling his stories. It's just great. He tells a story about a woman named Agnes. We'll kind of get to it in a second. He was on his way to Honolulu, if memory serves. He was going to Honolulu for a church conference. And he was going to teach and preach over the next couple of days. Wherever he had come from, I guess his biological clock was still on a different time zone. So at like 2 o'clock in the morning, he wakes up and is hungry and wants to start his day. He goes down to the hotel lobby and says, hey, where can a guy like me go find a bite to eat at 2 o'clock in the morning? I say, around this hotel, there's really not much open. There's one place. You go down the street, it's Harry's Diner. You hang a left. It'll look like an alley. It's not really an alley. You're safe. Just go ahead and go down. You'll find Harry there. He's still going to be cooking breakfast for folks. Go ahead and go in. And he goes in. He's the only person in there. He sits at the counter. He gets a cup of coffee and a donut. He chats with Harry for a second. He sits quietly. He reads a book and drinks his coffee. So 30 or 40 minutes later or so, there are fewer kids at the service, so I can probably just say, the ladies of the night show up. The prostitutes have gotten off their shift, basically, and they come to this diner. And they are loud and raucous. There are 12 or 13 of them. He's trying to still read his book and just pay attention to what he's doing, but he can't help but overhear some of their conversations. And he's intrigued by what they're talking about. He's intrigued as he hears one of them say to her colleague, hey, you know what? Tomorrow's my birthday. The colleague, snarky and rude, just says back to her, like, yeah, what do you want me to do about that? Throw you a party? And she's wounded. She's shaken. Something, it cracks into something that breaks that thin veneer for her of strength. She says, no, I don't expect that of you. Why would I expect that of you? There's never been anybody in my life who's thrown me a birthday party. Never had a birthday party my whole life. I wouldn't expect that from you for a moment. She pulls herself back in and tries to regain her strength and composure. They eat their dinner and then they leave. Tony looks at Harry, the diner owner and operator, and says, hey, listen, I happened to overhear that conversation. If I paid you right now so that you didn't have to worry about it, would you help me throw a birthday party for that young woman? I'll come back tomorrow at the same time. Are they going to be here? And he says, oh, yeah, that's Agnes. She comes in every night at about 3:30. We've known her for years. Harry calls his wife out. This lunatic wants to throw a birthday party for Agnes. They decide it's a great idea. So they go out and they get crepe paper and streamers, and they get a big sign that says, Happy Birthday, Agnes. And they have a cake made, Happy Birthday, Agnes, and they put candles on top. They get there at 2:30 in the morning the next morning. They decorate the place like crazy. 3:30, sure as clockwork, here comes Agnes and her friends. They step in. Not a word has to be said before she's in a puddle of tears. It is literally the first time anybody has celebrated her birthday with her. She cries tears of gratitude as she understands for the first time that somebody might love her in spite of who she is, who she believes that she is. She can't bring herself to eat the birthday cake. It's too precious a gift, right? It represents to her this love that she's experienced for the first time. This gift is too incredible, and if she eats it, it's gone. She has to hold on to it. So she asks, hey, can I take this and take it back home so I can show it to people? Maybe can I keep it and put it in my freezer? And Tony says, yeah, absolutely. Of course, you can do whatever you want to with your birthday cake. It's your birthday cake. He says, before you go, can we say a prayer for you? Sure, she says. And so they all hold hands. 13 prostitutes, an evangelical preacher, Harry the diner owner and his wife, circle up and hold hands, and they pray for Agnes. That God might remove from her any burden or shackle or chain that would keep her from understanding that God loves her that way always and forever, not for any reason other than the fact that she's God's child. We pray that she can be freed from the captivity of the life that she had been in, that God would be good to her. At the end of the prayer, Tony says, Amen. She looks back at him and says, you didn't tell me you were a pastor. What kind of church do you belong to anyway? And he laughs, still telling the story as the words come and form in his mind. I belong to the kind of church that throws birthday parties for prostitutes at 3:30 in the morning. And she responds, that church doesn't exist. There is no church that does that. Harry jumps in as well and says, yeah, if there were a church like that, I would have been going to that church forever. I would have gone to that church every Sunday my whole life. That church doesn't exist. Tony Campolo can't help but incorporate those words into his life, knowing that they are true in certain ways. How very few churches that people encounter would be the kind of church that would be scandalous enough to go out of their way to throw a birthday party for a prostitute at 3:30 in the morning. But he reflects on it and he says, that's the kind of church our founder started. That's exactly what Jesus would have done, right? That's exactly what the Word made flesh would have done. That's exactly what the Word filled with grace and truth would have done. It's exactly what love incarnate does. It's what love does, right? It's what grace does. Such a shame that some people have not encountered a church that way. Ultimately, it's a choice about how we want to operate in this world. Once we understand ourselves to be recipients of that same grace, it's a choice to incorporate that in our lives and say, that's so real that I can't possibly imagine a scenario. And so we become disappointed every time we encounter another scenario where we ourselves haven't lived that way. But it wakes us up and says, I can do it again. That wasn't the most graceful thing I've ever done, but I'll try again. The fundamental framework that says that you and I are not better than Agnes because we've been more moral, because we've been better. We're the same as her because we're just as beloved. The framework that says that she is not more or less lovable than you or I am. I don't deserve the love that God gives me. I'm just grateful for it. The ones who are willing to incorporate that in their lives and consume it like bread that is necessary for our survival, and not just that, but to savor every ounce of it. The flavor of it's so good. And I don't want to lose sight of it. I have to taste it again. That's what it is to be the church. We're often really, really good at it. Let's not forget what it tastes like. Let's keep going after it. keep being that church. Let's make it so there's no one that we've ever met who could possibly say that church doesn't exist, because we've been bred for them, because Christ has loved us and sent us into the world to love others, because grace is so real that, like our prayer says today, grace is so real we've been given the gift of the Spirit that we might manifest the power of God in this world. Let's manifest grace in the world. Let's make it such that everyone knows that they too are a beloved child of God and a recipient of the greatest gift ever given, a love that can radically transform this world, starting with me. Amen.